there are economic problems facing Putin, but I don't think they're so much to do with the sanctions as to do with the fact that he's spending vast amounts of money on defense because he has to. I read that the Kremlin are now talking about bringing defense expenditure down come 2026 because they spent so much money on providing an army that isn't really doing much more than maintaining the status quo.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now, today, on day 1,247 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation, or full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we're very privileged to be talking to Eliot Wilson again. Eliot was a clerk in the House of Commons from 2005 to 2016, where you worked on the Defence Committee and was secretary to the UK delegation of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. You're now a writer and commentator on politics, international affairs, and security, and you write for City AM, Spectator, The Hill, and a contributing editor to Defence on the Brink. Eliot, welcome back to Frontline.
Pleasure to be here, Philip.
Now, peace talks today in Istanbul. I think they've got together. I've seen some pictures of people around the table. Yet the Kremlin officials were dismissing them before they even sat down around the table. Is there any genuine prospect for diplomatic progress here, or is this simply political theatre from both sides to manage international perceptions?
I don't think there's much chance of progress. I think it's political theatre on a number of levels, depending on which side you're on. I mean, it's quite clear that the Russians really have no interest in drawing the conflict to a diplomatic conclusion, partly because they think they have a chance of winning, but also because they're not willing to abandon any of their initial war demands. They're still insisting that Ukraine must effectively disarm, it can't be a member of NATO, it needs effectively to give Russia a veto over its foreign policy because they've talked about, not allowing Ukraine to engage in various international alliances and things like that. I mean, fundamentally, and we've talked about this before, Vladimir Putin doesn't believe that Ukraine should exist. He doesn't believe it's a thing. He doesn't believe it's a country. And so what he wants is to get as close as possible to absorbing it into Russia's at least sphere of influence, what the Russians call the near abroad, or actually into Russia as part of a recreation of the empire. So there's very little impetus on the Russians to seek a diplomatic solution. I think on the Ukrainian side, there's a deep-seated reluctance to think about it, and you can understand why, because Russia invaded them. They are a sovereign country, and they're now being asked by a much bigger power, the United States, under duress, effectively, to concede something like a fifth of their country to the country that invaded them. But I think they've come to realize that they at least need to be seen to be engaging with this process. I still find it difficult to imagine what a diplomatic solution would look like. But I think Volodymyr Zelensky understands that from Donald Trump's point of view, he needs to show willing and show that he's the reasonable guy and that Putin isn't.
Yeah, well, warfare is diplomacy by other means, and it's difficult to work out what the conditions are going to be so both sides are on the same sheet of paper to negotiate things. But Zelensky recognised that Ukraine's not going to be able to take back the territory that Russia's captured so far by military means. And he'd had that as part of his plan even before Donald Trump was inaugurated. But the Russians don't seem to be on the same sheet or talking about it at all. Do you think they're ever going to come in, or what do you think needs to happen to force them to the negotiating table?
I think the problem for Vladimir Putin is that, he is obviously a dictator, an autocrat. He doesn't need to worry about public opinion to that extent. But I think like any autocrat, like any strongman, he is reliant on not the goodwill necessarily, but the acquiescence of his inner circle and other powerful people in the Kremlin. And, he's staked quite a lot on this. He's talked very tough, gone to the point of threatening at least tactical, if not strategic nuclear escalation over Ukraine. He said repeatedly, Ukraine is part of Russia. This is all part of his grand project of recreating not actually the Soviet Union, I think, but much more like the Tsarist empire. And so he can't afford to walk away from any kind of negotiations with something that looks like he's failed. Now, what in the strange sort of kabuki theatre of Russian politics that looks like, I'm not sure. Obviously Russia doesn't have anything remotely approaching a free press. His approach to the general populace will be very different to the one he takes with his colleagues and his subordinates. But he needs to look like all of this has been worth something, because let's remember, the Russians have lost 1 million men killed or injured. This is World War One levels of casualty. We talked a lot at the end of the Cold War about how the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan had been one of the things which brought the Soviet Union down. The losses in Afghanistan between 79 and 89 look, almost tiny and inconsequential now compared to the losses that Russia has sustained in Ukraine. So Vladimir Putin needs to be able to come to an end of this process and say, this is why we did it.
Yeah, no, interesting. But yesterday we saw, the first major protests in Kyiv is how they've been billed out across some of the reporting. Some people have said they're anti-government. Other people are saying they're anti-corruption in looking at it. But it was triggered by President Zelensky signing a controversial new law that seems to weaken the independence of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau. Now, President Zelensky then came out to say that no, he signed this to try and take away the Russian influence in what was happening to try and deal with corruption. But corruption is such an important piece to maintain Western support for Ukraine. Do you think this is the first sort of little signs of something not quite right in the political structures inside Kyiv, given the fact that Zelensky has just done a sort of reshuffle of his cabinet and his government?
I think it's a concern, and I think it's a concern because a lot of European countries and America indeed will be concerned, and it will also undoubtedly be weaponized by people who never supported assisting Ukraine anyway. I think there's also an element of a lot of Westerners. It's like the first romance coming to an end. We idolize Zelensky to such a degree. We built him up in this Churchillian figure. And undoubtedly, he has very many extremely fine qualities: physical bravery, apart from anything else, resolution in terms of being a war leader. He's not perfect. I don't doubt that. And I don't think the sort of political structures of Ukraine are by any means perfect. It's still a relatively young country since the breakup of the Soviet Union. And it may well be that he is not the ideal sort of platonic picture of a democratic leader. And I think that will play on a lot of European minds. I think my view is that we need to keep this in context. Zelensky may not be perfect, but we are dealing with a binary situation. We're dealing with either keeping Ukraine alive as a sovereign state, or it's ceasing to exist. And under those circumstances, that's not carte blanche to Zelensky to do whatever he likes. And it's not to say that we can overlook corruption or whatever. There's clearly a lot of work to be done there, certainly in terms of Ukraine ever joining the European Union further down the track. But I think we need to keep it in proportion. We are not fighting for a perfect democratic Ukraine. We're fighting for Ukraine to exist.
Well, it's interesting, given where Ukraine was coming from, which was almost as corrupt as Russia, with oligarchs underpinning the political structures, and Zelensky being the first president to come in on an anti-corruption ticket. You can't fix it overnight. And he was unpopular at the beginning because all of those who were losing their money and losing their influence were fighting against him, and the Russian invasion sort of gave Zelensky that opportunity to try and take it further forward. So of course he's going to be tainted. But tell me what government across Europe or across the world isn't tainted by some form of corruption somewhere.
I agree. And I think the other problem that Zelensky has, and this is, not to anything like the same degree, but something that our current government has discovered, is that if you come to office with very high-minded ideals and professions of being so much better than your predecessors and whiter than white, then any slight taint, and I'm not for a moment suggesting that the problems that this government had early on are comparable to what's going on in Ukraine in terms of degree, but if you disappoint people, then it just makes the situation all the worse. And I think that's why some people will be looking at Zelensky and thinking, well, hang on, we thought you were this sort of knight in shining armor, this crusader against corruption. And it turns out you're maybe 50% better than the last guy. Well, 50% better than the last guy is not bad. And we are dealing with democratic institutions which are incredibly young. We're less than 40 years since the breakup of the Soviet Union. And, Russia is a country which has no tradition of democratic institutions, representative democracy, and in terms of Russia, I mean the old imperial Russia, so that would include Ukraine and the other former Soviet states. They're building virtually from nothing here, and it's all very well for us to say that we have a public accounts committee which goes back to the middle of the 19th century. We have a parliament which can be traced back to the 13th century, and it's all very well for us to say, well, come on, you need to do it better than this, chaps. But we took a long time, and there's a limit to how quickly we can expect countries like Ukraine to come. I think it's about what we decide is their trajectory and what we decide is their degree of goodwill. And I think that is still probably in Zelensky's favor.
Yeah, well, we made all our mistakes before we had Times Radio broadcasting them out, or social media in everyone's pocket, and therefore we could do it all quietly. And it was written in the history books by those that had a favourable view of how we dealt with things rather than an accurate view. So yeah, difficult trying to develop a democracy today. But looking at the support that's coming in for Ukraine, it's based on Western countries having that confidence that Zelensky is doing the right thing from an anti-corruption perspective and doing the right thing to protect the rest of Europe. The UK and Germany are now spearheading this 50-day drive to arm Ukraine. It seems as if it's directly mirroring Donald Trump's 50-day ultimatum to Putin before he brings in these secondary sanctions. But at the same time, the EU seems to have brought in sanctions against some of the countries that are accepting Russian goods and have unilaterally dropped the price that's paid for Russian oil to, I think, $47.60 per barrel. Is this a shrewd strategic move by the EU to align themselves with Washington, or are they trying to get ahead of what Washington's doing and try and maneuver Washington so that they put them in a position where whenever the 50 days is up, which I think is the 2nd of September, Donald Trump has got nowhere to maneuver?
I think the problem that the European members of NATO have is that obviously to an extent we have to align ourselves with what America is doing, because America is the biggest dog in this fight, and their attitude will be critical to what happens in the future. But aligning yourself with the United States while Donald Trump is president is it's like trying to dance with somebody much larger than you who doesn't necessarily know the steps and may not even accept that they're dancing, and could step away at any moment. So I think this idea of 50 days, yes, it brings us to a stage which is roughly comparable with when Donald Trump's patience supposedly will run out. But at the same time, we know from long experience now that Donald Trump could wake up tomorrow morning and decide that actually he's been wrong about his buddy Vlad, and that he can't cope with this rude little man from Ukraine anymore, and it's all going to change. There is no logical consistency to Donald Trump's attitude, except the sort of instincts in his own mind, and no one else knows what they are. I don't think he knows often. So planning when you're looking at what America will do next is incredibly difficult. I see why the UK and Germany have said there's this kind of 50-day window. It's probably the least bad approach, but it's fraught with risk, undoubtedly.
So would you put a bet on to say Donald Trump's going to bring in secondary sanctions on the 2nd of September at day 50 if Vladimir Putin doesn't cooperate? Or would you put a bet on Vladimir Putin just continuing to stick two fingers or one finger up at Donald Trump and ignore everything that he's trying to do?
I think Putin will almost certainly do that. It's a matter of how Trump responds, how he perceives it, and how he decides to respond. We know that Trump's great claim to fame is that he's a deal maker. The fact that his track record actually suggests he's a fairly poor deal maker, and has flirted with bankruptcy on a number of occasions when he was a younger man, and neither wrote nor read The Art of the Deal, this book that he cherishes so much, is irrelevant, because it's about how he sees himself. And so he's going to want to produce something at the end of this which shows that he's the far-sighted one. And I think also that he's been right where everyone else is wrong. I think that's an important part of Donald Trump's psychology. It may be that he suddenly decides to get tough. I mean, it was interesting when he had his cabinet meeting a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about how pissed off he was with Vladimir Putin and how he felt he'd been strung along. I mean, it's the closest to vulnerability I've seen Donald Trump admit, possibly in his public career. So it may be that he decides to increase sanctions. And of course, the EU has increased sanctions very recently. My worry is that I can't claim to expertise on every part of international history, but I'm struggling to think of a dispute or a conflict in which sanctions were the answer. It didn't work in Iraq. It didn't work with the Libyan invasion of Abyssinia in the 1930s. They can be one part of a response, but they often target the wrong people, as we saw in Iraq between the First and Second Gulf Wars. And they're often ineffective. Because ultimately you're asking commercial actors to act against their advantage, and that can be very difficult.
Well, not only are you doing that, but you're also asking commercial actors who are on your side and complying with the legislation around fraud and business practices from your perspective to work with organizations that are underpinned by organized crime and criminality and different ways of doing business behind closed doors that where nothing comes out into the public domain. And it's difficult to sanction something that's illegal anyway. So we're not on the same playing field. Yeah, on that, the EU's and talking sanctions, the EU's announced its 18th package of sanctions, with getting, as I said, the oil down to $47.60 a barrel, targeting Russia's shadow fleet. Do you think that these are going to have an effect, whether it be a tangible effect or not, on Moscow's ability to continue to prosecute the war? Will Putin be concerned about where his economy is going and the potential for this, especially if it does start to impact those that are buying Russian oil and everything else, and they say this is too hot for us? Do you think Putin will be concerned?
I think it's probably on his list, but I doubt it's very high up. I mean, the thing about sanctions is that, clearly this is, I think, the 18th package of sanctions. Well, the previous 17 haven't stopped the war, have they? And, undoubtedly this will make things slightly more difficult for Russia. It will encourage maybe one or two companies or indeed countries to think twice about their level of engagement with Russia. But, they have a strong relationship with Iran, a strong relationship with China. Both of those are enormously helpful. And I mean, I think there are economic problems facing Putin, but I don't think they're so much to do with the sanctions as to do with the fact that he's spending vast amounts of money on defense because he has to. I mean, I read that the Kremlin are now talking about bringing defense expenditure down come 2026 because they spent so much money on providing an army that isn't really doing much more than maintaining the status quo. So I think there are economic issues facing Putin, and they may end up being decisive. We can only hope. But I don't think the critical part of those will be sanctions by the EU.
Do you think that Putin is doing deals with the likes of China and India to get their support or to get the cash from them today that he's not going to be able to live up to and pay back properly in the future? And it's going to create more friction between them rather than ease things off? Or is he just mortgaging big chunks of Russia away to the likes of China?
I think it's difficult to tell because this sort of axis of this alliance of evil or autocracy, Inc., as Anne Applebaum has called it, is a very weird sort of conjunction of interests because the four major countries we're talking about, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, are held together not particularly by common positive interests or by ideology or by culture or by history, but by the fact that they are against what we perceive as the interests of the West and particularly the United States. So they're a kind of, they're the anti-American gang. And that can be enormously powerful. Strength in adversity against a common enemy is a very powerful binding force. But it does mean that when it comes to these intricacies of relationships, in terms of trust, in terms of what you think is going to happen 5 or 10 years down the line, particularly when you've got, Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and the supreme leader in Iran are all old men. There's no guarantee that any of these people will be around in 5 or 10 years' time. So it's difficult to gauge exactly what's going on. I'm sure that Putin will be giving China anything that it needs up to a point to keep the war effort going. Because I think at the moment, Vladimir Putin's agenda is topped by continue the war against Ukraine, because there's still a chance, and I think it's important to remember, there is still a chance Russia can win this. I think exactly how big a chance is another matter. So I think that's Vladimir Putin's priority. But I think the fact that they're talking about defense spending coming down does mean there is a recognition in the Kremlin that things are going to be a bit sticky over the next 5 years, up to the end of the decade, if that's the kind of time frame we're talking about.
Well, we also had the Chinese say to a senior EU representative that they didn't want Russia to lose because it would allow the United States to focus all its activities and efforts into what China is doing. Do you think that will have a marked effect on the way China continues its support to Russia? And do you think they're really concerned about what the Americans would do to try and stop Chinese influence around Southeast Asia and elsewhere?
I think from the Chinese point of view, clearly Ukraine is a sideshow. Beijing doesn't care what happens to Ukraine, except insofar as it has implications on Beijing's security. Now, clearly, if, for example, Ukraine were to collapse and Russia were to take over, and America were to step back and say, "Well, we did our best, but what's done is done," that would leave America completely free in the kind of Elbridge Colby school of thought to devote itself to Southeast Asia and the South China Sea, and particularly Taiwan. I think there are a number of things that we need to consider. The first is, and this is a terrible cliche, but like most cliches, it has some truth in it. The Chinese think much further ahead than we do. Xi Jinping, who is now basically going to be president for life, sees as he would call it, the reunification of China and Taiwan as an essential part of his mission and his legacy. But that doesn't mean he's going to be pressured into anything. I mean, my view is still that there will be some kind of confrontation really quite soon. I would have thought before 2027, 28. Maybe not a hot war, but some kind of confrontation over the states of Taiwan. But that's what the Chinese are thinking about, and they will think of everything else in relation to that objective. The difficulty with the American approach to Taiwan is we really don't know what it is, because Donald Trump, on the one hand, clearly thinks China is his biggest threat. At the same time, he harbors this recurring idea that Taiwan is on a long list of people who have done him wrong or who have cheated America somehow because they stole our chip business, he said, which is utter nonsense, but the veracity of it is immaterial. And so he's reluctant to say wholeheartedly that he would defend Taiwan. He said that, Taiwan's a few miles off the Chinese coast and it's thousands of miles from us. The implication being, why should we care? And of course, the agreements that are in place between China and the USA are not commitments so much as abilities to provide support. America does not have to go to war to defend Taiwan. There is no piece of paper which says that. What America is obliged by treaty to do, what that means with Donald Trump in the White House is another matter, is that it has to supply Taiwan with arms and equipment for self-defense. Now, if we look at it more broadly, if you were trying to act rationally, then you would think the relationship with Taiwan, the support for Taiwan, is critical because it plays into the relationship you have with Japan, with South Korea, with the Philippines, that whole network of American allies, which allows America to operate interests in the Pacific. But we know that's not how Donald Trump operates. And so he has this yin and yang of America wanting to be strong, but at the same time not really seeing Taiwan as something that is something he should get out of bed for. And I think the Chinese, clearly if I'm telling you this on Times Radio, then the Chinese know it. So everything that Beijing does will be viewed through the lens of its own interests, and particularly its own interests in terms of Taiwan. And I think that's how we need to understand them looking at Russia and Ukraine.
Well, and Xi Jinping, as you said, thinks in longer terms. So he'll think in multiple generations. And he knows that Donald Trump's got 4 and a bit more years, and that's it. You talk very much about the budget, and it's emphasizing the cost of war to Russia, and Russia looking at reducing its defense budget. One of the things you've written about beforehand is the financial disparity that there is in war. And we're now seeing relatively cheap drones been able to destroy multi-million-dollar worth pieces of equipment. Some of them are irreplaceable because the production lines don't exist anymore. Kyiv is doing the same. Has Kyiv successfully inverted the economic pressure that there is in its approaches back to Moscow, which is why Putin is trying to suggest we need to reduce our budget and therefore stimulate his military to go for these cheaper weapon systems that seem to be having a good, if not better, effect than the more expensive one.
I think they've gone a long way. I mean, I think what's fascinating is the resourcefulness that Ukraine has shown in terms of developing technology and industry, the pace of change that they've been able to keep up with, which frankly puts most of the rest of the West to shame. And the way that they have, I think, Russia has also come a long way in terms of understanding how unmanned platforms work and how they interact with more traditional types of warfare. But I think Ukraine has generally kept a sort of edge in terms of innovation and practice. There's a lot of, if you look at how Russia has behaved in military and tactical terms, there is a strong whiff of sort of the early days of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, where you have very clumsy, very reactive military responses on the Russian side, and their enemy is much more flexible and much more agile. I think this idea of the sort of disparity is one that's developing incredibly quickly. Back in 2022, we were talking about, oh, well, the tank is dead. There is no more future for the tank because this drone can destroy it. And I think, armored warfare now looks very different from the way it did 5 years ago, because you can't have a 70-ton Challenger 2 out in the open, because a 10,000-pound drone at best will destroy it. At the same time, that's not really teaching them anything we didn't know, because we've known that since at least the Second World War. The problem that the Germans had after D-Day was that they couldn't move their armor during the day because they had no air superiority. So there is an element to which it's the evolution of that. But I think what's unclear is where we're going to end up with, do we end up effectively with drone-on-drone warfare? What Thomas Barnett calls the military singularity, where you have essentially people behind the lines on both sides having this weird kind of proxy robot war almost in the middle. And what does that say about warfare? What does that say about the occupation of territory? What does it say about ethics and psychology? Is quite an interesting issue. But I think Ukraine has done well to push back against Russia's response to it. Russia has put a lot of money into drone technology. It's also bought a lot of drones from Iran, as we know. And I think one of the echoes of the First World War that you get from the conflict in Ukraine is that you have commanders who don't know what kind of war they're fighting, and what will be decisive, or at least one of the factors that will be decisive ultimately, is how quickly they learn. And in those terms, if I had to put my money anywhere, it would be on Ukraine rather than Russia. But it's a learning process all the time. We don't know what next week or tomorrow holds.
Yeah, well, interestingly, on the learning process, I've read that Ukraine is going to start to open drone factories in the United States and transfer some of its drone technology to the United States. And there was a tweet appeared on the US Army website this week that said, "Hey, have you ever seen a drone drop a grenade before? Look at the US Army do this for the first time ever." And then they suddenly looked at all the comments that were coming in and the posts that were coming from Ukraine, and suddenly went, that doesn't make us look very good, and they took the tweet down. But that shows the disparity that there is between, supposedly the strongest military in the world and Ukraine are actually fighting a conflict. But looking at the flurry activity that has been over the last sort of 48 hours, the intense air attacks that are going into Kyiv, Kyiv's attacks against Russian critical infrastructure and railway lines and all the rest of it, this 50-day drive for weapons the peace talks that we both think are going to stall today. We might get an agreement on a few more prisoners being released. But what's your biggest takeaway at the moment on where the state of this war is? And do you think we're going to be talking about it for another 18 months, 2 years, longer?
I think there's a good chance of that. I think the worry, in a sense, is that it settles down into a kind of frozen conflict, because that helps nobody. It doesn't deter Vladimir Putin, which is one important consideration. It would leave Ukraine in a very difficult position in terms of economic development, in terms of democratic development, if they've effectively got a border with Russia, which is a semi-war zone. At best, we might hope for some kind of demilitarized zone, like they have between North and South Korea. The problem in terms of finding some kind of even interim solution is that to reach some kind of peace settlement, you need to be able to do one of two things. You need to be able to trust the other side, or you need to be able to bully them into doing what they've said they'll do. And we know that neither of those apply to Russia at the moment. I think this could be going on for another year. It could be a matter of ebb and flow in terms of the severity of conflict as peace talks come and go. Bear in mind, the Korean War hasn't ended yet. There was only an armistice signed in 1953. The war has not fully concluded. But I think the problem is that we've seen that when the shipments of weapons were suspended from America to Ukraine recently, Vladimir Putin and the Russian armed forces did exactly what they were bound to do, which is up the ante and start very heavy airstrikes against Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities. They've kept doing that. If we can get enough equipment to Kyiv to upgrade their air defense back to somewhere where it was, then that would be great. But I think we need to be, I'm sure the Ukrainians are already thinking this, but I think Europe needs to come to the realization that in terms of defending Ukraine, it's not just about air defense, it's about striking at Russia. It's about stopping Russia being able to do what it's doing now. And you saw that brilliantly with the drone strikes on Russian airfields, one of which was virtually on the Chinese border. It was thousands of miles away. That was an outstanding, absolutely breathtaking piece of military theatre as much as anything else. But I think it's interesting that you've seen Russia basically throwing all the ordnance it can get vaguely in the direction of Ukraine, whereas Ukraine is striking at, as you say, critical infrastructure, railways, bridges. There is clearly a much more sophisticated military operation going on in Kyiv, but we know that sophisticated military operations don't always win. I think if you have a spectrum of how this will pan out, a complete Russian victory is possible, but I would hope unlikely, because I would hope that if it hoved into view, Europe would finally wake up to the fact that this is unacceptable. I think a complete Ukrainian victory, whatever that would mean, is virtually impossible, because I don't see Ukraine getting the 20% of their country back. So I think we're sort of looking for that part of the dial in the middle. And I think we haven't yet reached a place where there's anything tangible that we can say this is acceptable for Ukraine to live with. And will put a sufficient dampener on Vladimir Putin's ambitions, because he is an imperialist. He wants Russia back, and he's not going to stop at a bloody nose in Ukraine.
Well, sad that it is, given the price that the Ukrainian people are paying, and the Russian soldiers are being forced to pay by Vladimir Putin. It gives us a perfect opportunity to talk again and again and again. Eliot, it's been a real pleasure talking to you today on Frontline.
Pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.